Episode 22, World War I. Question 1. What was the Triple Entente, and what common interest led to its creation? The Triple Entente was the alliance formed between Britain, France, and Russia in the early 20th century. It emerged not from a single formal treaty, but from a series of diplomatic agreements. The 1894 Franco-Russian alliance, the Entente cordiale between Britain and France in 1904, and the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. By 1907, these three powers had aligned closely enough that they were widely understood as an informal but powerful counterweight to the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The common interest that led to the formation of the Triple Entente was the shared fear of German expansion and militarism. Germany's rapid industrial growth, naval buildup under Kaiser Wilhelm II, and aggressive diplomacy, especially during crises like the Moroccan affair, convinced France, Britain, and Russia that their security depended on cooperation. Each state also had specific concerns. France feared another German invasion. Russia felt threatened by German and Austrian influence in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and Britain worried about Germany's growing navy and its challenge to British global dominance. Ultimately, the Entente was driven by a desire to balance German power, maintain European stability, and protect each nation's strategic interests. This alignment set the stage for the opposing sides of World War I. Question 2. What role did imperialism play in the outbreak of World War I? Imperialism played a significant and often underestimated role in the outbreak of World War I by heightening competition, deepening rivalries, and fueling tensions among the major European powers. Between 1870 and 1914, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Italy competed fiercely for colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. This scramble for empire intensified distrust, encouraged militarization, and created a global atmosphere of zero-sum competition. Germany's late arrival into imperial competition after unification in 1871 heightened tensions with Britain and France, who already possessed large colonial empires. Germany's desire for a quote-unquote place in the sun frustrated Britain, which saw German naval expansion and overseas ambition as threats to its global supremacy. Meanwhile, France and Germany clashed repeatedly over North Africa, especially during the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, which nearly pushed Europe to war and which solidified the Entente against Germany. Imperial competition accelerated the formation of alliances, dividing Europe into two hostile blocs: the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These alliances did not cause war directly, but made it far more likely as any local crisis now risked drawing in multiple powers. Russia and Austria-Hungary both sought influence in the Balkans, an area once controlled by the declining Ottoman Empire. This rivalry turned the region into a geopolitical powder keg. Austrian expansion threatened Russia's claim to be the protector of all Slavic peoples, while nationalist movements, particularly in Serbia, were influenced by imperial pressures. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand occurred within this context of competing imperial ambitions. Because the major powers had worldwide colonies, what might have been a regional conflict became a global war. Imperial networks amplified a localized Balkan crisis into World War I. In essence, imperialism created the rivalries, alliances, tensions, and global structures that made a massive war not just possible, but likely. Question 3. How did the relatively local event of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, along with his wife Sophie, trigger a world war? The assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, triggered a world war not because of the act itself, but because it occurred within a highly volatile system of alliances, rivalries, and militarized nationalism. The killing, carried out by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, linked to the secret society the Black Hand, was seen by Austria Hungary as a direct challenge to its authority in the Balkans. Convinced that Serbian nationalism threatened the survival of its multi ethnic empire, Austria Hungary, backed by Germany's quote unquote blank check of support, issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia actually accepted most demands, but not all, prompting Austria Hungary to declare war. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of all Slavic peoples and eager to maintain influence in the Balkans, mobilized in support of Serbia. Germany then declared war on Russia, and because of the Franco Russian alliance, on France also. Germany's war plan required invading Belgium to reach France quickly, which brought Britain into the conflict due to its commitment to Belgian neutrality. Within a week, the entire alliance system had activated. What began as a local conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia expanded into a continental, then global war because the great powers were bound by treaties driven by fear and prepared for conflict in the age of militarism. Question 4. Why was warfare on the Western Front so deadly? And a hint, think about psychology and technology. Warfare on the Western Front in World War I was extraordinarily deadly because modern industrial technology collided with outdated military psychology and tactics. Generals on all sides still believed in concepts like offensive spirit, courage, and decisive battlefield charges, ideas rooted in the 19th century. They expected wars to be short, mobile, and won by bold advances. Instead, the Western Front became a static landscape of trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, where these old assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. Machine guns, rapid-fire artillery, barbed wire, and long-range rifles made the battlefield overwhelmingly lethal. A few men with a machine gun could mow down hundreds in minutes. Artillery, responsible for most World War I casualties, could destroy entire units before they ever saw the enemy. Poison gas added a new, terrifying form of mass killing, though its impact was more psychological than tactically decisive. Poison gas attacks accounted for less than 1% of total deaths. Likewise, new technologies like flamethrowers, tanks, and military aviation were more exotic than significant. The vast majority of deaths were simply the result of artillery or machine gun fire. Defensive technology, reinforced bunkers, trenches, had become much more effective than had offensive tactics, but military leaders were slow to adjust. Despite repeated failures, generals continued launching massive frontal assaults, convinced that a big enough push would break through enemy lines. The French High Command was especially committed to the doctrine of élan vital, the belief that courage, morale, and a fighting spirit could overcome any defensive firepower. This faith in offensive spirit led France to launch repeated frontal assaults, even in the face of machine guns and artillery, contributing to a disproportionately high percentage of early war casualties. This mindset, not limited to the French, produced battles like the Somme and Verdun, where hundreds of thousands died for gains of only a few miles of ground. Soldiers were ordered to leave the relative safety of trenches and charge across open, challenging terrain directly into machine gun fire, a near suicidal act. Trench warfare created a deadly stalemate. Once both sides dug in, neither could advance without huge losses. Trenches protected soldiers, but trapped them in miserable conditions where they were still vulnerable to artillery bombardment, gas attacks, snipers, and disease. Indeed, more American soldiers died from influenza than from battlefield injuries. The Western Front was deadly because modern technology made killing easy, while outdated psychology and tactics ensured men were repeatedly sent into situations where survival was unlikely. Industrial war had arrived, but military thinking had not yet caught up. Question 5. How were Russian experiences on the Eastern Front representative of the social tensions that had existed in Russia since the early years of the 19th century? Think about how the Russian people reacted to the losses in the Crimean and Russo-Japanese wars. What effect would the losses in World War I have? Russian experiences on the Eastern Front during World War I exposed and exacerbated the deep social tensions that had shaped Russia since the early 19th century. For decades, Russia had been marked by a rigid social hierarchy, widespread rural poverty, and an intractably autocratic political system resistant to reform. Military defeats had repeatedly exposed those weaknesses. The loss in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, exposed Russia's technological backwardness and contributed to the push for reforms like the 1861 emancipation of the serfs. Later, humiliation in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, triggered mass protests, strikes, and the revolution of 1905, demonstrating how quickly military failure could result in political upheaval. When World War I began, these underlying tensions were still unresolved. The Russian army suffered from poor leadership, inadequate and insufficient equipment, and weak infrastructure. Catastrophic defeats such as Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties, reinforcing public anger at the incompetence of the Tsarist regime. The differing experiences of officers and conscripted soldiers further emphasizes the disparity between aristocrat and peasant. Most Russian officers came from noble or upper-class families and had received formal training in military academies. They often entered the war with a strong sense of duty, loyalty to the Tsar, and expectations of honor. Conscripts, by contrast, were overwhelmingly peasants, many of whom were illiterate and had been drafted with little understanding of the war's purpose. Their connection to the state was weak, and loyalty to officers or the monarch was fragile. While officers did face real danger, especially junior officers leading frontline attacks, by far the highest casualty rates often fell on ordinary infantrymen sent in mass assaults with little support. Conscripts absorbed the brunt of Russia's catastrophic losses. Soldiers at the front felt abandoned and became increasingly unwilling to fight for a government they didn't trust. On the home front, wartime strain led to severe food shortages, crippling inflation, and the breakdown of transportation networks. These pressures revived the same patterns seen after earlier defeats, but on a much larger scale. The losses in World War I discredited the monarchy completely. As the war dragged on, desertions rose, strikes spread through the cities, and faith in Nicholas II collapsed. By 1917, the combination of military disaster and domestic hardship created the conditions for revolution. In this sense, Russia's World War I experience was not a new crisis, but the culmination of long-standing social, political, and economic tensions. Question 6. How did World War I transform the position of the United States in international diplomacy? In what ways did the U.S. benefit from the war? World War I fundamentally reshaped the United States' position in international diplomacy by transforming it from a relatively cautious, regionally focused power into a central actor in global affairs. Before 1914, the U.S. largely adhered to a tradition of limited involvement in European politics. By 1918, however, the U.S. had emerged as a decisive military and financial force whose participation had tipped the balance toward Allied victory. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and advocacy for the League of Nations signaled a new American ambition, shaping the international order, promoting collective security, and influencing peace terms. Although the Senate rejected the League, the mere fact that Europe looked to the U.S. for leadership marked a major shift. Economically, the United States benefited enormously from the war. As European powers exhausted their resources, the U.S. became the world's leading credit nation, replacing Britain as the center of global finance. American industries, especially steel, chemicals, agriculture, and munitions boomed as the Allies purchased vast quantities of supplies. The US also expanded its merchant fleet and global trade networks. Politically and diplomatically, World War I elevated the United States to great power status. Even though the US retreated into isolationism during the 1920s, its economic power and moral influence meant that it could no longer be ignored in global decision making. In short, World War I transformed the United States from a peripheral actor into a key architect of the modern international system. Question 7. Why did the Germans ultimately agree to an armistice, and why would this lead to the stab in the back rallying cry for Hitler and the Nazis? Germany ultimately agreed to an armistice in November 1918 because its military and political situation had become unsustainable. By the fall of 1918, the German spring offenses had failed, Allied counterattacks were breaking through the Hindenburg Line, and the arrival of over 1 million fresh American soldiers had decisively shifted the balance. German armies were retreating, desertions were rising, and food shortages had reached critical levels. At home, the British naval blockade had caused food scarcity and civilian unrest. Strikes and protests signaled a collapsing society. Naval mutinies in Kiel in late October showed that even the military had become unreliable. With Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire already collapsing, Germany faced the prospect of total defeat and invasion. Military leaders like Ludendorff recognized this reality and urged the civilian government to seek an armistice. The situation fed directly into the stab in the back, or Dolchstoßlegende, myth after the war. Because Germany agreed to an armistice before Allied troops reached German soil, many Germans, already shocked by defeat, struggled to accept that the war had been lost militarily. Right-wing nationalists exploited this confusion. They claimed that Germany had been betrayed by internal enemies, socialists, communists, pacifists, and especially the new democratic politicians who signed the armistice. In this narrative, the military had remained undefeated in the field, but was undermined by weak or treacherous civilians back home. Hitler and the Nazis later weaponized this myth. It allowed them to delegitimize the Weimar Republic, vilify political opponents, and rally supporters around a vision of national rebirth through militarism and authoritarianism. Question 8. The Paris peace talks and the Treaty of Versailles that followed it failed both in how they addressed imperialism and in how it treated the Germans. Explain this claim. The Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles failed in addressing both imperialism and Germany's post-war treatment, creating conditions that destabilized the international order and contributed to future conflict. Although Woodrow Wilson spoke of self-determination, the Allied powers largely ignored this principle when it came to their own empires. Instead of dismantling imperialism, the treaty system repackaged colonial rule through the League of Nations mandate system, allowing Britain and France to take control of former German and Ottoman territories such as Iraq, Syria, Palestine, and Tanganyika. These mandates were essentially colonies in all but name. Asian and African delegates who hoped for independence were dismissed at the talks. Japan's proposal for a racial equality clause was rejected, and Vietnamese petitions for autonomy were ignored. Promises made to Arab allies, who had been key in the fight against the Ottomans, were reneged upon by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The message was clear: imperialism would continue for the European victors, the Americans, and the Japanese, despite wartime rhetoric promising otherwise. This hypocrisy damaged the credibility of the post-war order and fueled nationalist movements across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. At the same time, Versailles imposed harsh conditions on Germany that bred resentment and instability. Germany was forced to accept war guilt, pay massive reparations, demilitarize, and surrender territory and colonies. While not as crippling as later claimed, these terms humiliated Germans and weakened the new Weimar Republic, which had to sign the treaty under immense pressure. Many Germans viewed the peace as unfair and vindictive. I am inclined to agree, reinforcing the stab in the back myth and undermining trust in democratic leaders. In short, Versailles preserved imperialism when many expected reform, and punished Germany in ways that were politically toxic and strategically ineffective, two failures that helped sow the seeds of later global conflict, including World War II. Question 9. In what ways would World War I trigger the waves of nationalism throughout the European empires, sowing the seeds for independence movements in Africa and Asia? World War I triggered waves of nationalism across European empires and sowed the seeds for independence movements in Africa and Asia by fundamentally altering the relationship between colonizer and colonized. Millions of colonial subjects were drawn directly into the conflict. Africans, Indians, Arabs, Vietnamese, and others served as soldiers, laborers, and support personnel for Allied powers. Their participation exposed them to new ideas about rights, citizenship, and self determination, and demonstrated that Europeans were not invincible. Seeing European armies suffering mass casualties and relying on colonial manpower punctured the myth of Western superiority that had justified imperial rule. At the same time, the Allies' wartime rhetoric, especially Woodrow Wilson's call for self determination, raised expectations that subject peoples would gain greater autonomy after the war. Instead, the post war settlement actually expanded imperial control under the League of Nations mandate system. Former German and Ottoman territories were placed under British and French administration, reinforcing colonial rule rather than dismantling it. The contradiction between promises and practice generated disillusionment and resentment. Economic hardship also intensified nationalist sentiment. Wartime requisitioning, forced labor, and disrupted trade damaged colonial economies at the same time that taxes and prices rose sharply. Many returning veterans found that their service earned them little respect or political inclusion. Movements such as the Indian National Congress, the Egyptian Wafd Party, Vietnamese nationalists under Ho Chi Minh, and various African intellectual and workers' groups grew rapidly after 1919. The war forced the European empires to rely more heavily on colonial subjects to administer their own territories. As thousands of British, French, and Belgian colonial officials were recalled to serve as officers in Europe, much of the day to day governance in Africa and Asia fell to locally recruited clerks, teachers, police officers, and civil servants. This shift gave many colonial subjects a first real experience of managing taxation, justice, transportation, and local bureaucracy. In many regions, the transition went unexpectedly smoothly, demonstrating that local populations were fully capable of running bureaucratic systems without European oversight. This contributed to a growing sense of confidence and political awareness amongst educated Africans and Asians, who came to see that independence was not only desirable, but also practically achievable. The experience of governing, however limited, helped nurture the nationalist leadership class that would spearhead independence movements across the colonial world. Finally, the collapse of the Russian, German, Ottoman, and Austro Hungarian empires demonstrated that imperial systems could implode. Anti colonial leaders drew inspiration from these upheavals. In sum, World War I weakened Europe's moral authority, exposed the fragility of empire, and mobilized colonized peoples in ways that laid the foundation of the independence struggles of the mid 20th century. Question 10. Why was Mohandas Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha so effective in rallying Indians to the nationalist cause? Unlike earlier nationalist strategies that relied on elite debate or occasional violence, Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, or truth force, emphasized nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, and the moral power of refusing cooperation with injustice. It offered a unifying moral vision that cut across India's divisions of class, caste, religion, and region. This approach allowed ordinary Indians, peasants, workers, women, merchants, and students to participate without needing weapons, political training, or leadership roles. Satyagraha also resonated deeply with Indian cultural traditions, drawing on Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist ideals of self discipline and non harm. By framing resistance as a moral duty rather than a political tactic, Gandhi empowered millions who had previously felt excluded from national politics. His campaigns, boycotting British goods, refusing to pay unfair taxes, and marching peacefully, were easy for people to join and difficult for colonial authorities to suppress without appearing brutal. Equally important, Satyagraha exposed contradictions of British rule. When peaceful protests were met with violence, as they were at Amritsar in 1919 when troops under the command of Brigadier General Reginald Dyer fired on unarmed protesters, killing upwards of 100 people, it undermined Britain's claim to govern India with justice and fairness. Gandhi's philosophy thus mobilized mass support while painting the British into a morally untenable corner. Satyagraha succeeded because it was inclusive, culturally grounded, morally compelling, and strategically effective in transforming ordinary Indians into a powerful, unified political force. Question 11. How did the post war European treatment of the Middle East set the tone for what would become the modern Islamic enmity towards the West? During the war, Britain and France had made sweeping promises to Arab leaders, most notably through the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, suggesting that if Arabs revolted against the Ottomans, they would gain independence. At the same time, however, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 divided the Middle East into British and French spheres of influence, revealing that the Allies had intended to control the region rather than liberate it. After the war, these plans were formalized under the League of Nations mandate system, which placed Palestine, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria under European administration. This sense of betrayal was compounded by the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain supported the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine without consulting the Arab majority already living there. The resulting demographic, political, and territorial tensions set the stage for long term conflict and fueled a perception in the Arab world that Western powers were willing to reshape the region for their own strategic interests. European rule also disrupted traditional governance systems, imposed borders that ignored ethnic and sectarian realities, and often favored minority groups, creating lasting instability. The combination of broken promises, imposed borders, and perceived exploitation fostered a legacy of resentment. This resentment evolved into a broader narrative that the West was untrustworthy, interventionist, and hostile to Islamic political aspirations, a sentiment that continues to influence modern Middle Eastern politics and contribute to anti Western sentiments to this day.